Live from the headquarters of Tell Us Your English in Quito, Ecuador. This is From the South, and I'm Sweeney Gray. After months of trying to reach an agreement, the dialogue between the Venezuelan government and opposition has been suspended indefinitely. The president of the Dominican Republic, Danilo Medina, who has been hosting the talks, said it had not been possible to get both sides to sign a document that contained the points which had already been negotiated.
President Nicolás Maduro has expressed his desire to continue dialoguing, even telling me that he is prepared to implement all of the agreements included in the document that the government signed yesterday, even without the signing of the opposition. The opposition has asked that we not close the doors of dialogue, that we leave a window open to continue working. We from the Dominican Republic and the accompanying countries are always in favor of dialogue. We understand that the path for Venezuela's reconciliation can begin with agreements which can be reached at a negotiation table.
Venezuelan opposition representatives had refrained from signing the agreement on Tuesday. After talks went late into the night, the Dominican president called on both delegations to meet again on Wednesday morning, but to no avail. As he arrived for that meeting, the former Prime Minister of Spain, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, who has been the lead mediator between the two sides, said a failure to agree could be catastrophic for Venezuela and Latin America.
This is the decisive moment. These are decisive hours. That is the truth. I hope the opposition reflects and that any observations they have are in accordance with what both parties have discussed in the last few days, and to which I have been witness. The final document that was presented is the summary of that dialogue. There can be, of course, some adjustments and clarifications, some more precision or guarantees, no doubt about that. But all the essentials are there. And those essential elements, especially regarding the political situation of Venezuela, focus on choosing a date for the presidential elections and on having electoral and international observation guarantees. The best answer to the situation that Venezuela is going through is to have elections that will come soon, so that we can know what the people's decision is. The opposition has to make a very important decision today.
Let's go to our correspondent, Freddie Gillingham in Caracas, who's standing by with an update on developments in the Dominican Republic. Hello, Freddie. What's the latest from the dialogue?
Hi, Soini. So the big breakthrough came at around 3 p.m. today when the president of the Dominican Republic, Danilo Medina, officially announced that no agreement had come into effect. He addressed reporters in the capital of Santo Domingo. This is obviously a major setback and could well spell the end of these ever-fraying set of dialogues between the opposition and the government. So far, the dialogues have now been suspended indefinitely. The disappointment of this was best summed up on the face of Spain's former Prime Minister Zapatero, who was standing next to Medina as he gave that announcement. Zapatero is one of several international mediators who have been working tirelessly over the last few months to try and settle an agreement on 6 points between the opposition and the government. So what happens now? Well, just before I came on air, President Nicolás Maduro addressed the nation and declared that he would follow the originally proposed document that was set about on Monday. Whether the opposition will sign that, whether they will even come back to the negotiating table in Santo Domingo remains to be known. Julio Borges, the leader of the opposition delegation in Santo Domingo today, did announce that he was urging Maduro to not set an election date unilaterally. Whether his opposition can negotiate on that set date now, after today's news, remains to be seen.
Thank you so much for that update. We've been speaking to our Caracas correspondent, Freddie Gillingham. Other news now. The U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has been in Jamaica on the final leg of a regional tour focused on stepping up pressure on the Venezuelan government. Tillerson told Prime Minister Andrew Holness that Jamaica is the United States' closest ally in the Caribbean, and that's why it was the only Caribbean stop on his tour. According to Prime Minister Holness, they spoke of U.S. help in lessening the risk of Jamaican banks' exposure, as well as energy security and the situation in Venezuela.
Secretary Tillerson reiterated the concern of the U.S. government on the political and economic crisis in Venezuela and the impact on the most vulnerable. We both agreed that positive engagement between the government and the opposition in Venezuela is essential, and expressed regret that the attempts of the OAS to promote dialogue have not been met with success.
The United States appreciates Jamaica adding its voice to the major issues affecting our region, and the Prime Minister just spoke very eloquently about the concern we all share regarding the situation in Venezuela. Jamaica's votes in the OAS to achieve stability, prosperity, and support democracy in Venezuela have demonstrated exceptional support to the human rights issues that confront us in the Western Hemisphere. We will continue to ask our partners to support the people of Venezuela during this very trying time for them. And we will continue, the United States will, to put pressure on the Maduro regime to return its country to free, open, and democratic elections. The people of Venezuela deserve this.
To discuss Secretary Tillerson's visit, we're being joined by Dennis Brooks of Nationwide News, live from Jamaica. Hello, Dennis. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Good afternoon, and good afternoon. We're glad to be with you.
So while Prime Minister Holness said everything the U.S. wanted to hear, he certainly lacked enthusiasm. Is Jamaica being pressured into a position on Venezuela that it's not comfortable with?
I wouldn't say it's being pressured into a position that it's not comfortable with. I think that our position is clear. Right now, Jamaica is in the process of repurchasing our 49% in the Petrojam Kingston. And it's very important. We need to buy Venezuela is urgent after that U.S. executive order last year. Very difficult for Petrojam to buy on the international market. So the response of Tillerson was key, although one would say that he was not clear in how he felt the region as it continues to pressure the Maduro. I think that maybe things were doors that would suggest that more was happening than we are told.
Okay, so Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to ask you another question, but we're having slight audio problems, so that's the only reason I'm going to cut this interview short. But thank you so much for joining us. We've been talking to Dennis Brooks of Nationwide News in Jamaica about Rex Tillerson's visit on the island and the outcome of that. Other news now. The Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arias, arrived in Suriname on Wednesday as he continues his tour of Latin America and the Caribbean. Arias has been traveling throughout the region as a counter to the tour of U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. He has already held meetings with President Desi Bouterse, who says he believes in keeping the peace.
In all countries, we try to live in peace, keep this kind of region as a peace zone. At the same time, we do believe in solidarity with each other, and in this moment of time when things are, let's say, very difficult, we have to use our everything we have and be very innovative to try and solve the problems.
And our correspondent, Rolanda Segura, is traveling with Arreaza and sent this report from Paramaribo.
Sí, en efecto, el canciller de Venezuela, Jorge Arias.
The Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arias, is continuing this tour for what he calls the diplomacy of peace through various Latin American and Caribbean countries. And he's now here in Suriname, where he's meeting here with the Speaker of the National Assembly. Earlier, he was at the Presidential Palace, where he met Suriname's President, Desi Bouterse, to explain firsthand the situation in Venezuela and the development of the dialogue with the opposition. On that subject, President Bouterse said how important it was to ensure peace in Venezuela for all the countries of the region, and he expressed support for President Maduro's determination to keep seeking peace.
We thank Rolando for that report. We take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting on. Welcome back. A 16-year-old indigenous girl has died in the region of Choco in Colombia after military forces bombarded the area on January 30th. Our correspondent Lorena Hoyos has more.
Yesterday, the 16-year-old indigenous girl who was hurt during bombing by military forces in Chacpientordo in the Chocó department died. Her medical team said that she lost part of her limbs, and then sadly she died. We went to the area and talked to the indigenous people and with the Afro-descendant community living close to the area about the impact that this had on them. The bombing took place in an indigenous reserve and close to the River Tordo, an essential space for the livelihoods of these communities, where they grow crops and fish to feed their families. Now the communities are afraid to go in the area because they believe another attack could happen. They told us that after the attack, young people from the area were taken by the police and were accused of being insurgents, and the community had to defend them and push for their release. They also told us that throughout the ceasefire between the government and the ELN, they were living in peace, a peace that was broken by this attack. They are afraid and there is uncertainty in the communities that continue to live here. They say they have been abandoned by the Colombian government and only see its presence through military actions. They say they never see education or medical brigades coming to help people. They wonder what will the future be. They are clear on one thing. They don't want a war or military actions that would put them in the center of the conflict, and they don't want to be displaced like the Hunan people. We'll be back with more details.
We thank Lorena Hoyos for that report. Former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe has been accused of being involved in 2 paramilitary massacres. Medellin's Supreme Court has requested an investigation be opened against former President Uribe over his alleged involvement in the massacres in 1998. The court presented testimonies of several ex-paramilitaries and survivors that affirmed the murders took place on a farm belonging to the family of the former president. Brazil's Central Workers' Union has announced a national day of protest against pension reform on February 19th. The provisional reform is being pushed by the government of Michel Temer. The action could be extended until February 23rd. Organizers say that measures will be particularly harmful to workers. They are rejecting the proposals following a session earlier this month where changes to a pensions amendment in the Constitution was discussed. It is agreed that the government will vote on the issue after the Carnival holiday on February 19th. Also in Brazil, former President Lula da Silva's lawyers can now submit evidence in relation to his prison sentence. The defense will have until the 20th of this month to do so. The Federal Regional Court published a judgment against Lula in its entirety so that the lawyers will be able to present their evidence. Given the unanimous conviction, the defense may only submit the so-called declaration embargoes, which can call for clarifications on the judgment, but not reverse it. After presenting evidence before the court, lawyers may also present evidence to the Superior Court of Justice and the Federal Supreme Court. Communities and environmental organizations in El Salvador are fighting to protect the mangrove forest and its biodiversity. We have more in the next report.
El Salvador has 8 protected areas around the country. The Jiquilisco Bay and Barra de Santiago are just 2 of them. Mangrove forests are in danger because of the unregulated use of river water and bad farming practices.
This ecosystem is threatened by the sugarcane cultivation. Farmers take the water from the rivers and are damaging the water basins just so they can keep their crops. They also burn crops.
The wetlands of the mangrove forest have to feed from fresh and salt water, a balance that is hard to achieve now because of the lack of water sources that go to the forest. People from Garita Palmera make their living from fishing from the mangrove, now contaminated by chemicals used for the cane sugar production. Environmental reports reveal that wetlands have reduced by over 50%, especially mangroves. This affects around 20,000 people living in 18 different communities from Barra de Santiago. They fear for their food safety.
We need the mix of fresh and salt water. This mix means the mangrove can live along with the fish. 80% of the population in the region lives off fishing activities.
Environmental activists with the communities and the Ministry of Environment are pushing for the rivers to be cleaned and the reforestation of critical areas that could help maintain the ecosystems.
If the mangrove disappears, so will several species. Many of them come here during the winter to nest, to survive. During the summer, they go upstream.
The damage to the wetlands is not only affecting the people of Garita Palmera. The reduction of the mangrove forest worldwide also influences the rise of temperatures, making the countries in the region more vulnerable.
3 people have died in floods and fires in north and central Argentina. Some 800,000 hectares were burned in the province of La Pampa and more than 100,000 others in the province of Mendoza. More than 17,000 people have been affected by floods. Thousands have been evacuated from the province of Salta. Cuban independent media have said they want nothing to do with a new Trump administration initiative to create more U.S.-controlled media outlets on the island. The U.S. State Department announced the creation of a Cuba Internet Task Force in January to look at opportunities for expanding Internet access and independent media in the Caribbean country. The United States already channels money to alternative media in Cuba, and the government has branded the new initiative as subversive.
The situation with alternative media is twice as grave. We're not just talking about something that would magnify tensions in the country's political situation, but a move that could damage the credibility of an independent media.
I think it's much easier now for Cuba, for the government, for the youth, for independent media to maintain such an openly aggressive standing. We reject this attempt to interference in our politics, in Cuba's internal affairs.
Antigua and Barbuda's lower house has passed a drugs bill allowing households to have up to 4 cannabis plants. Cannabis is used by a large section of the population, according to Prime Minister Gaston Brown, and 70% of the population is in favor of decriminalization. The bill now moves to the Senate and Gazette, where it will likely become law. Lawmakers have begun to discuss how legalization will affect the tourist industry and cannabis use for medicinal purposes.
Marijuana, utilized in different forms, has significant medicinal benefits, and certainly we'll move pretty quickly to ensure that we legalize the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes.
The Caribbean Development Bank will allocate up to $800 million for disaster relief operations in the region. The funding will be allocated to Caribbean countries over the next 5 years. $38 million have been earmarked for Antigua and Barbuda after the destruction left by Hurricane Irma. The bank's president, Warren Smith, stressed the need for liquidity after a natural disaster. The government of Mexico and the European Investment Bank are two of the main contributors to the relief fund.
Approximately 1,200 households now have access to improved.
Guyana is hosting its inaugural International Petroleum Business Summit. Recent major oil discoveries in Guyana could see an increase in oil revenue in the next 5 years. They've already signed a multi-million-dollar production sharing agreement with ExxonMobil, with an ExxonMobil subsidiary in waters that are claimed by Venezuela. Guyana's top legal advisor in the border controversy, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, told local media on Wednesday it could take years for the International Court of Justice to make a decision, but any decision made would be final. He also said much of what happens depends on Venezuela. We take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting on.
Options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. This is, we're all over the world, and we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away.
Welcome back. Black Lives Matter activist Muhyiddin Debaha died on Tuesday after being shot in New Orleans. He drew national attention when he took down a Confederate flag at a South Carolina gathering of white supremacists on live television. New Orleans police say the circumstances of his murder are unknown. The judge in the New York trial of Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has ruled the identities of jurors will be kept secret. The prosecution had called for jury protection, citing Guzman's use of hitmen for more than 2 decades. Guzman was extradited to the U.S. in January last year. He pleaded not guilty to running an international drug trafficking organization. His defense team says today's ruling gives the false impression that Guzman is dangerous. Now let's have a look at some other stories from around the world.
Strong aftershocks continue to rock Taiwan after a 6.4 magnitude earthquake hit the island on Tuesday. At least 5 people have been killed and more than 200 injured. Many buildings have been damaged in the city of Hualien, and rescue workers continue to search for missing people.
At the moment, there are still probably people trapped inside, but there's no way for us to confirm their position or number, because the people living there aren't long-term residents.
Turkey's foreign minister discussed airstrike attacks on Syria with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. during his visit to Tehran. Iran urged Turkey to stop its military offensive earlier this week, saying the operation in the northern Afrin region breached Syrian sovereignty and would increase tension in the war-damaged country. African migrants demonstrated outside of the Rwandan embassy in Israel against the government's policy to deport African refugees and asylum seekers from Israel to Rwanda or Uganda. On January 3rd, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced implementation of a plan to deport about 38,000 migrants living in Israel illegally. The controversial plan gives them until the end of March to leave voluntarily or face jail and eventual expulsion.
In 2016, they put me in a jail for a year. When I came out, the Israeli government wanted to deport me to Rwanda or Uganda. Those are not my countries. I'm not volunteering to go there. I'm Eritrean. If they want to deport me, they can send me to Eritrea.
African National Congress leader Cyril Ramaphosa said he was holding direct talks with Jacob Zuma over a possible transition of power. Zuma, in power since 2009, has been South Africa's most controversial president since the end of white minority rule in 1994. His tenure has been marked by economic decline and allegations of corruption.
A portrait of a Nigerian princess that was lost for more than 40 years has been found in England. It will be sold at auction in London, but will also be broadcast live to bidders in Lagos. Tutu, by Nigeria's best-known modern artist, Ben Nwanwu, was painted in 1974. The portrait of Adetutu Ademiluyi, a granddaughter of a revered traditional ruler from the Yoruba ethnic group, holds special significance in Nigeria as a symbol of national reconciliation after the 1967-1970 Biafran War. The auctioneers Bonham say the portrait could sell for up to $400,000. And that brings us to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at tellusyourtv.com.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sonia Gray. Thank you so much for watching.